All right. We have several people joining here. We are going to wait just another few moments before we get started with today's presentation. Let everything tabletop off with the attendance coming in. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're here already, we'll get started here shortly. All right, we'll give it about another 15, 20 seconds and we'll get started here. All right, we'll get started. We got attendance tabletop and off. Like to say thank you very much for joining. Good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to MAD Security's final town hall of 2025. We know this time of the year is very busy. And before we begin, I want to actually apologize in advance for today's content because it is going to jump around just a little bit. We're talking about what we learned in 2025. We're talking about what you should be looking out for and what you should know for 2026. Again, reason simple for the jumping around. 2025 taught us a lot, and we want to give you valuable information across several areas for all different types of attendees. Audit prep, common pitfalls, assessor expectations, budgeting, scoping, what's coming to 2026. And no, we couldn't cover everything in today's content just due to time limitations. So if we didn't cover what you're looking for, please get to us afterwards. We're going to have some contact information for us throughout this presentation. Reach out with any questions, whether if we can answer by email or we can set up a 15, 20-minute call just to discuss what you're currently going through and see if and how MAD Security can assist, we can do so. But again, thank you so much for joining us. Excuse the Christmas sweater. Today is Christmas sweater day here at MAD Security, and we're having a good time celebrating the holiday. Hope you are too. So wherever you are in your CMMC journey, starting fresh, halfway through, if you're preparing for certification already, you'll find something relevant and helpful today. We are joined, as always, by our CMMC Compliance Lead, Jaclyn Jones, who has led our team through dozens of assessments this year, including MAD Security's own successful CMMC Level 2 audit in March with a perfect score, SPRS score of 110. Jaclyn, thank you for being here, and thank you for everything you and your team are continuing to do for our clients.
Happy to be here.
All right, so we are going to start here today by looking back at 2025, what we have learned from real audits. As we supported clients through preparing for their audits this year, we noticed some consistent challenges. The first one I'm going to touch on today is documentation gaps. They were the number one stumbling block. Most organizations had the technology in place, but their SP, their policies, logs, or the procedures didn't fully reflect what they were doing. Jaclyn, what did you see whenever you're looking at documentation gaps?
Yeah, so that's the main gap we have with a client, whether we do a gap assessment or if we're at the point to where, prepping for the C3PO assessment. So what the C3PO assessors are going to want to see is that you've got your policies documented, your procedures documented, and then you be able to intelligently talk about them during the assessment interviews. So if the technology may be in place, maybe you're doing everything perfectly right on the technology front, but you don't have those things documented, or maybe there's a process that you just ad hoc follow where everyone in the office knows what it is, but it's not in a written procedure or process somewhere. That's what the assessors are looking for. They want to see it documented, and then they see that ahead of the assessment interviews. And then as they're talking to you, they're going to want you to tell them what your process is. And they're doing a correlation to make sure you're following what you say that you have written. And that shows that you have a repeatable process that can be, essentially repeated in the future. So that's the biggest gap, is that the documentation is just not fully fleshed out as much as it needs to be.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah, I can vouch for that as well. I talked to several prospective clients throughout each week, and that is what everybody comes to us. They're like, hey, we just really need help with the documentation. So yeah, whenever we first start dealing with anybody new that we're unfamiliar with, from that point, documentation is a big starting point that we can view, and just that'll actually tell us a lot about where somebody's at in their journey. The second thing we'll touch on here, staff preparation was a major factor in if somebody was successful or a little slower to success. Many companies kind of underestimated how ready their team needed to be to walk the assessor through the controls. what did you see from like a staff preparation perspective, Jaclyn?
Yeah, so the bad part is if a client doesn't do any kind of prep. You need to make sure that your staff has an idea of what evidence you're planning to show the assessor, how you're going to talk through it, how you're going to talk about your CUI data flow, how your HR personnel is going to talk about employee onboarding, transfer of an employee, how you do a background screening, and some other things. And so you really need to have some kind of dry run, mock assessment, something like that, even if it's just an internal walkthrough of make some kind of plan of how you're going to present evidence, how you're going to talk about it, and then that way, you're not spur of the moment trying to come up with these things in the middle of the assessment. So part of what we do, we have virtual compliance manager service at Mad Security. Part of that is we try to help you guys identify who's the best person to talk about the evidence, what you're going to show. And it also helps you not get tripped up, because what if the C3PO assessor is used to companies doing something one way, but it's not the way you're currently doing it, but you are meeting the full requirements of the control. So it's really just about being prepared to justify what you're doing and how it meets the requirements. And if you don't do any kind of preparation at all, your staff might be almost like deer in the headlights. They don't know what to say. They might get caught off guard. They start to stumble, and then you are doing what you're supposed to. You just can't explain it correctly. So staff preparation is like key. And again, dry run, mock assessment, do some kind of preparation for your staff, and you're likely to be more successful in those assessments.
Absolutely. Yeah, viewers, Jaclyn just touched on several things that we're actually going to elaborate on a little bit further on in this presentation today, give a little more information on things like assessment preparation. And if we don't cover it there, if that raised more questions for you, we are going to have the live Q&A towards the end. So remember that, save all those questions, or go ahead and enter them throughout this presentation as we go. And the third thing, if we could have a top three, we would say that we saw that enclave scoping created confusion. Things like CUI boundaries, data flow, system inclusion. It was misunderstood at many companies. We tell everybody that scoping is arguably the most important part of CMMC compliance. What did you see from that aspect?
Yeah, that's especially true. A lot of companies that we talk to, they honestly just don't know where all CUI is in their environment, and that's really important to determine, because the scope of CUI for your C3PO assessment, your certification assessment, it depends on what your scope is. And so it's what stores, transmit, process a CUI. What are things that's protecting that CUI? And a lot of things that we see trip up a company is they think about the common things. Maybe they use GCC HID, maybe they use something else. But the issue is also where they don't think about CUI might flow. Like, is CUI on your work or on your laptop, and that laptop is being backed up somewhere off-site that has CUI data in it? Well, then your backup has CUI. Other things, are you printing CUI? Do you have a Linux machine and your documentation only mentions Windows? Like, those are the things we see trip people up, just because, and a lot of times they just don't truly understand where CUI is. It's very important to get that established from the get-go, because all your documentation needs to reflect where CUI is in your environment. So that's the main trip. They just don't know where CUI is.
Absolutely. And again, if that brought up more questions, viewers, go ahead and throw those in Q&A as we continue to go. We will get to those as we continue. For now, we will go ahead and move on. I'm going to tell you a little bit of what I saw from my perspective. Again, my name is Adam Starnes, account manager here at Mad Security. I am not the most deeply technical individual that you can speak to from that point to be able to speak on all your different technology stacks and what you're doing for this control in particular. But it was really interesting for me to be able to go on site during assessment time and actually see it firsthand and get to be able to learn about something that actually happened in front of my eyes, to where it could be something that maybe you could relate to later on or understand why it's important. So earlier this year, I went with someone from our compliance team, and we went to go on site for a level 2 assessment. The assessor began marking a few things after the first day as trending not met. Now let's understand this. It's not met it was not met because the controls were missing, not because the documentation was wrong. Simply the assessor was unfamiliar with the method the client used to meet the control. Something that we have to understand is that a see-through PAO is different, or every one of them is different. Their interpretation of the controls could be a little bit different. It's very important to know how to interpret controls from different viewpoints for this reason, because you have some see-through PAOs that are brand new to assessments, and you have some that have been in the game for a long time, and you have different viewpoints. In this particular case, the controls were met. The environment was compliant. Everything was documented correctly, but it was simply a case of implementation unfamiliarity. Now, our VCM consultant was able to step in and explain the design, walk the assessor through the evidence, and the findings were removed and trending met from that point. So kind of the lesson here is that depending on who your see-through PAO is, and I'm not going to even point out who we think is good or bad, because that's besides the point. The point is that they can be interpreted different ways. So meeting the control is only part of it. Documenting it correctly is another large part of it. But being able to explain how you meet each control to the assessor during the assessment in multiple ways, just in case they understand it differently or just in case they're unfamiliar with the way you did it, is the part that a lot of people forget or they don't even think about. This is why having a seasoned VCM consultant that's been through several different assessments with several different see-through PAOs is invaluable. The client did end up passing with a perfect score of 110. So it was turned right around. And that's just proof that there are different ways that it can be interpreted and still be correct. All right, so we have got kind of another real life story here where our SOC actually pulled together some evidence to save. Jaclyn and I were speaking about this the other day. Jaclyn, you care to share that story with us?
Sure. So a lot of the controls have to do with a monitoring aspect, which usually means is there some kind of log that can kind of back up that activity is being recorded somewhere. So there is a particular control, I don't remember which one it is, and the client was having a lot of issues trying to find that activity being logged somewhere in their environment. And so since they had our SOC, which is Security Operations Center, the SIM solution, you're sending logs there for correlation. Our SOC analyst joined the meetings, and they were able to find the log that the assessor was wanting to see. And so the proof that it's being logged because it's sent to the SIM solution, and they were able to show the assessor that log. And so therefore the client got a pass on that control. So just because they couldn't find it in their environment, I mean, obviously it was probably there, they just couldn't easily locate it, and our security operations could, so therefore we were able to show the assessor that. And that's kind of like the way that we essentially showed evidence on their behalf to show that they were meeting the requirements of control.
Absolutely. And that just goes to show there was probably another way that the client could have proven it, but there was multiple avenues of getting there. So that just kind of shows that being able to understand how to prove the evidence is so important, which we're actually going to get into here in a little bit later about preparing before the assessment actually comes. But yeah, there's several avenues, and understanding how you can do it is very important. All right. So something else that we've learned in 2025 and still continuing to go into 2026 is there is a lot of growing confusion about requirements. One major trend in 2025 was the sheer number of prospects who were confused about their requirements. We heard things like, we think we're level 1. Does CMMC even apply to us? Our prime hasn't said anything yet. We don't see anything in our contracts. So to clarify on that, your contract tells you a requirement. It's not the guesswork, it's not the rumors, not the assumptions. So you must check, does your contract include DFARS 252.204-7012 or DFARS 7012 that you'll hear some call it? If yes, then you are a level 2 organization handling CUI. You must ask your primes also. So like maybe you haven't heard from your primes yet. Maybe it's not in your contracts yet, but you're like, I believe based on what we do that we're going to be required somewhere down the line. Ask your prime straight up, what are your requirements for us? Do you require a certain SPRS score? Do you require level 2 readiness before subcontract renewal? A lot of primes are requiring that. Many companies were unsure about the upcoming requirements for their primes. And I get it. It feels better sometimes not to ask or not to bring it up because we want to think like if we don't talk about it, we might not have to deal with it or it'll just go away. But the truth is that you are going to have to be CMMC compliant if you're dealing with those contracts, and you're going to want to know ASAP. If you watched our webinar last week, you cannot submit your SPRS score less than the 88, and you can't lie and say you have an 88 or above if you don't, just because of the False Claims Act and the penalties that you could face. So, what real life examples have we seen about compliant readiness or deadlines? We've seen primes tell subs things like reach this particular SPRS score by this date, or we must source other suppliers. This is real. Also, everywhere, check everywhere on your contracts. We've seen suppliers miss new requirements because their prime added the CMMC terminology quietly into places like the acknowledgments of the contract, task orders, contract modifications, vendors recertification forms. Bottom line is, if you don't know your requirement, you're going to want to find out ASAP so that you can get started. So preparing for the C3PAO audit, some lessons that were learned over this last year. Jaclyn, do you mind sharing a little bit about this, what you've seen, what you should do preparing for the audit?
Sure. I also share several things. So the first thing, be prepared. Do not try to wing it. You're less likely to be successful if you do. You need to do the adequate prep. That includes making sure, take the time to collect evidence for each control. It is time consuming, but you're doing a verification of this is what we say we're doing. This is actually in place. This is what our configuration is. Don't assume that just because it was configured correctly 9 months or 2 years ago that configuration is still there, because things change. So that's kind of the big one. Make sure evidence is there. Go take your SSP. I highly recommend doing a dry run or a mock assessment with a third party. If you're going to do it internally, though, take your SSP, go implementation statement, objective by objective, walk through it, make sure if it says this is in this documentation, go look at the documentation. If it says you have this technical configuration, go look at the technical configuration. Make sure that they are actually in place, and then that you're prepared to talk about these things, because the assessor will go through objective by objective and ask you questions about each of one of these. So prepare your team. Prepare your HR, especially. They're going to want to talk to HR. They're not usually, they're not the technical people, but they're the ones who are responsible for onboarding your employees, operating employees, and employee transfers, background screens, things like that. Anyone who posts content to publicly accessible systems, that includes your, social media, your website. Those conversations are going to need to be had also. And then anything that you uncover an issue, fix it. Don't anticipate going to the assessment being able to have something open and be like, well, I'll just put on a poem. You really need to go into that assessment having the expectation that you do have all 110 controls fully implemented. And then again, if you have any third parties that are helping you, if you have an MSP and they are responsible for any of the control implementation, the assessor is going to want to talk to them also. Make sure they're prepared. If they've never gone through a CMC certification assessment interview process, you probably need to prep them and kind of like let them know exactly what they're going to need to talk about. And it's essentially, if they're responsible for any part of the objective, they're going to need to talk about it and show evidence on your behalf. So that's the preparation. Preparation is key. A next one I kind of also alluded to, meet the requirements of every objective. So don't yes, if you during your certification assessment, there are certain things you can put on a poem, but you don't need to rely on that, because what if the assessor finds more things that you thought you had open, and then that's not allowed to be put on a poem potentially, or you are only allowed to put a specific number on a poem, and then it's only certain controls. 5-point controls, you're not going to be able to put on a poem. 3-point, it's really the very minor things that are allowed to be put on a poem. So you really need to fix any issues exist. Go ahead and fix those for your C3PO assessment. And then also give yourself time to do it properly. Don't wait until the last minute, because if you have to rush to fix something, odds are you're going to not fix it correctly as you should. Another thing is obtaining any customer responsibility matrix, shared responsibility matrix from your third parties. What those are going to be the controls that your third party is responsible for implementing CMMC, but you as the company is ultimately accountable, responsible for making sure those things are correctly implemented. So during your assessment, the assessor is going to say, okay, so this is this third party, this is on your behalf, let's get proof, let's get evidence. Maybe they even have to walk through some things. If they are not doing it correctly or something's not correct, meet the requirements of control, that affects your assessment. So getting the CRMs and SRMs ahead of time is actually a requirement. You do have to submit that to your C3PO before the assessment. And also, if you store CUI in Microsoft GCC High, you also have to get the Microsoft CRM. And you get that by emailing us 0365fedrep@microsoft.com, I believe. If that's not it, but if you do have another cloud service provider that's FedRep moderate or equivalent, you have to get the body of evidence from them. So there are certain things you need to get ahead of time, and your C3PO will actually tell you exactly what they are. So you have to get those. Another thing is preparing your IT team. So a lot of people just think, we do this every day. We don't have to do any kind of prep. We don't have to do any kind of walkthrough or anything like that. But you really need to prepare your team. So you need to decide who on your team is the most knowledgeable to talk about each control. So if one of your team does firewall, they need to talk about the firewall. If someone else does, maybe only user account management, have them talk about those. And then everyone else just don't talk. Like there might be some periods of silence where the assessor is taking notes. Don't try to fill that in with nervous talk or anything like that. Just basically just sit there, let the silence happen. And then also, if one person is talking about the requirements control and someone else isn't, you're almost kind of like showing a separation of duties by doing that. So if you say, we have our separation of duties, this person does firewall, this person, on it can't access the firewall, and those two people aren't both talking about the firewall, you're kind of proving your separation of duties in a way. They still need to sit a different way, but it is a good way to kind of enforce that you do have that separation of duties. And then the last one is essentially just don't overshare. So if you're asked a question and you want to keep talking and keep talking, the more you ask, the more questions the assessor may have. And so essentially answer what's being asked, only show what's being asked. And if you don't know the answer, don't guess, don't ramble, actually give yourself time to come up with the correct answer. Another thing that I didn't also mention was verify your login credentials for your software. So if you use a third party, maybe you use SentinelOne, maybe you use something else, whatever it is, make sure those credentials haven't expired, like if they go inactive after a certain period of time, because the assessor is going to want you to open that software, show them proof of certain things. And so make sure your login actually still works. It's kind of like another lesson, the final lesson learned I kind of have here is make sure that you verify your login credentials haven't expired and that you can log in. And then that way you can actually show the assessor proof without having to do a reset or have someone else unlock your account. So but that's the main kind of like lessons learned that we have with us helping our clients through their certification assessments.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, Jaclyn, thanks for all that information because there was a lot there. The cool news is, if you're watching this, you're not already a current client of Mad Security, and if you are, you already know. Whenever we work through all these controls with you and we're checking these off and we're actually getting ready to prepare to go through your C3PAO audit, one of the parts of VCM is if you're under contract with that VCM service, whenever you're going through it, that's your VCM is actually there virtually with you during that audit. So we're actually going to help you and go back over all of this on how to prepare. We do have some information on the website. Of course, you can go back and watch this recording afterwards. So if you miss things there, you can, or if there's anything in particular you need us to elaborate on, of course, throw it in the Q&A for the Q&A session coming up here shortly. But yeah, a lot of information, definitely something that if you don't want to go through all of that alone, that's something that Mad Security can assist you with. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about reviewing documentation. Okay, so you got things like your SSP, your policies, processes. These are all things that you're going to need to do well before you actually go through your audit, but before the audit as well. Review the SSP thoroughly. Ensure every objective is addressed accurately. No NA unless the DoD or the CIO approval is documented. Remove unnecessary content that causes confusion, and confirm that every technical configuration matches what's documented. Then we're going to review the policies and procedures and ensure that the processes match real-world practice. You actually want that to match so that you can go and actually talk through the documentation. And then use specific timeframes like 90 days instead of annually. Verify version tables and signatures are in place. And then, Jaclyn, what else could you touch on as far as tips from reviewing your policies, procedures, or SSPs?
Yeah, and I'm actually going to touch on the time frame thing because that is something that we have had come up multiple times because people just they just don't think about when you document something. You might document something as annually. So what is your interpretation of that? Does that mean you do it every 12 months? The issue with that is if you say you do it annually and the interpretation is every 12 months, we have had an assessor like something was done, I think it was February of one year. And the next year it was done in March of the following year. Technically, it's 13 months apart. So it's really, you have issues when you don't define it as certain timeframes like 12 months. And annually, is it interpreted as calendar year? Is it interpreted as 12 months? So we really encourage people to actually get granular. The DoD released the Organization Defined Parameters Revision 3 for NIST Revision 3. And we suggest you use the timeframes that's in there. They use things such as like 90 days. They use every 12 months. So definitely go by those timeframes just to kind of not cause you any issues. Another thing we've seen recently was also during an assessment, a client had one documentation say they're doing something every 12 months. Another piece of documentation that was essentially talking about the same thing said 365 days, and the assessor didn't like that they didn't match. So if you have something that talks about the same thing in two different locations, make sure to me and you probably means the same thing, but it's not documented as the exact same thing. So they need to match also. Version tables and signatures. So the assessor is going to want to see you have your policy signed. That by the time you give it to them, they need to be in PDFs and they need to be signed. And that essentially shows that those are authorized, they are enforced within your environment. If you make changes to those policies, use a version table, and that's the same thing for your SSP. Just change the version, keep those updates in the table, and that also shows that you are reviewing those every 12 months, whatever your period of make changes is stated. So that's kind of like some ways that you can also kind of prove to the assessor you're doing the controls by, like I said, the update. If you say you're updating your SSP every 12 months, add another thing in your version table about, you made this update or whatever. So, but yeah, that's kind of like what we see is just reviewing your documentation, policies, procedures, version tables, signatures, all that comes into play, and all this kind of like shows the assessor and proves to them that you are doing a repeatable process.
Excellent. All right. Then we definitely suggest review CUI scope and the CUI data flow. We mentioned this earlier. We want to make sure that all in-scope assets are included: air gap systems, Linux devices, backup software, physical storage locations, printers, USBs, cloud applications. Review the data flow to include sources, destinations, firewalls, endpoints, applications, maybe things like service providers. Yes, service providers as well. Practice explaining your full CUI journey clearly and confidently. All right. And then we say review auditing and log retention. Verify that the SIM is receiving logs, validate API keys, confirm things like the log content meets AU. Let's see what control the AUL 23.3.1. Show evidence for full retention period, not just keeping last week's logs. And then Jaclyn mentioned this earlier. I'm going to have her go into it one more time here just because we don't want you to miss this. I'll say it. We'll let Jaclyn elaborate. But I tell everybody that I talk to that's getting ready to go into the assessment, conduct a dry run. Do not skip it. Jaclyn, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, that's essentially it. And dedicate time to doing it. If you try to fit it into your normal workday, which honestly, here at Mad Security, we tried to do, was not a great thing because everyone has their daily duties. You wear many hats. I'm sure everyone's in the same boat, but you need to schedule dedicated time to actually do this. Um, don't try to do it in one day. Spread it out over a week. Ideally, do it very close to the assessment, though, so that you are doing that prep work and you're ready to go into the assessment. If your dry run uncovers any issues, try to fix them because if you know the issues exist, likely the assessor is going to notice those, and don't rely on them being like, oh, maybe they just won't notice. Go ahead and fix those. Meet with your MSP a week before the audit, especially if they've never gone through one before. You really need to prep them and be like, or let them know you're going to have to show evidence for this control. What are you prepared to show it? And kind of talk them through what the control is actually requiring. Um, so one thing we also, the assessor may give you the option of attending either in-person assessment or virtually. Of course, there's some controls that they have to assess in person, the physical controls and some other controls. There's no way getting around that. But if they give you the choice, I highly recommend you choose the virtual option for the rest of the assessment interviews, just because it gives your team more of a chance to kind of like talk internally if needed, versus if you're sitting in the room with the assessor, it's a little bit harder. And that way you can't really have these side conversations, anything like that. And another thing is, be prepared to show the evidence that or how you're meeting the requirements controlled the way you are. And Adam's talked about this before. I think I've even mentioned it in this meeting. So if you're meeting the requirements of control, if the assessor asks one way, just say, here's how we're meeting the requirements of control, and explain what you're doing and be prepared to show evidence to show that. So that's kind of the thing. They may not be as familiar with how you're implementing the control, but as long as you can show them what you're doing, prove that it meets the requirements of control, and they agree, of course, they do have to say, yeah, this does meet the full requirements of the control. That's the most important thing. Just be prepared to back up what you're doing and be able to explain it, because you may have to explain it from start to finish to get them to understand. So just be prepared to do that as well. And then also, like we already talked about, the person who's the most knowledgeable about what the control is about, be the one to talk about it. Everyone else just remain silent. Let that person talk. Don't jump in. Don't try to interrupt. Don't try to fill, awkward silences or anything like that. Just let them talk and wait for the assessor to ask you something, answer that question, and then wait for the next question. That's the biggest tip I have, is just don't overshare and just let the awkward silence happen. It's okay.
Yeah, that was something that I had to learn was normal as well. I talked about I sat in on an assessment this last year, and sitting in there is a lot of silence. But silence is actually a good thing a lot of times. If they're not asking you to elaborate or picking it apart every time and they're making the notes, you just keep on rolling. Usually silence is a good sign. Let's see here. All right. One more thing I'll say about the dry run. The way I can put it, the most simple is dry run, mock assessments, whatever. We don't take Allen Iverson's advice and say it's just practice. Practice makes perfect. The more times that you're ready, I mean, you're going to pay a lot of money for these assessments to go through relatively. It's not something that you want to do over, or it's really not even something that you want to go into planning to put things in the poem like Jaclyn mentioned earlier. You want to go into it confident. So anything that you can practice, work out any tweaks, is definitely worth doing. SPRS and audit readiness. Just a few more tips here. Again, especially with the new 48 CFR went through in November, don't enter, a score of 88 unless you actually have 88 inside the system, or a 110. Remember that you've got things like the False Claims Act. You don't want to put scores in there that are not real. You want it to be sure that whatever you're saying that you have is where you're actually at. Also, don't go into the audit like we talked about saying that, oh, I have an 88, so I can go in so that I can POAM things. We just touched on that again here just a quick moment ago. You don't want to go in thinking we can do that, pass that for now, and then work our way back up to the 110. You want to go in sure that you're going to score the 110. If you miss one or two POAMs, then that's okay. So even the assessor interprets an objective differently, like we've mentioned a couple times. So you have some, that's why they give you a little bit of margin to adjust there. Additional 2025 lessons that matter for 2026. We're going to run through these briefly so we can get to as many Q&A questions as we can. Some primes are already denying contracts due to low SPRS scores. Several subcontractors have been given deadlines already. 48 CFR on November 10th, 2025 proved DOD's seriousness with CMMC in general. A lot of people didn't know if it would ever actually come. So it is in place now as of 2025. Something else, you should show 90 to 180 days of evidence to demonstrate maturity in what you are doing, not just start doing something right before you go into the assessment. You want to be able to show proof that you're doing it and how you're doing it. And something else we learned is no two clients look the same. That's why our tailored MAD process is crucial, that we're actually going to get to know you, get to know what you're already doing, and then we can tailor things to actually make sense for what your business is doing. We mentioned this before, different see-through PAOs and assessors interpret different controls differently. And then having someone who can translate assessor language is a major advantage. Something else we also learned is we cannot cover everything in one webinar, but we'll do our best every time, and then we'll do our best to answer all your questions in the Q&A. We had one more slide of the presentation here, but due to time, I do actually want to go ahead and move over to the Q&A session for you guys. CMMC is not just a checklist. We've talked about this before. It's not just a project. It's not a once-a-year event. It's a lifestyle. 2025 has proved that preparation, maturity, discipline, understanding your environment, that's what separates organizations who pass from the ones who struggle. So if you're here today and you're already taking the right steps right now, no matter where you're at in the process. So we want to say, hey, kudos for that. And then also, we're here if you do need a partner. I will run through these here quickly so we can go to the Q&A. You can go back and look at these in the recording that we'll send after. Before coming to the webinar today, especially during this busy season, we did want to offer you the free CMMC pre-assessment. You're going to be able to answer yes, no, maybe, or yes, no, unsure to about 31 questions, and it's going to give us a really good idea of where you would stand for CMMC readiness. We also have the free CMMC master bundle that's going to include 5 documents, including everything from how to handle CMMC as a government contractor all the way through to things like enclaving. We also have the assessment guide, which is going to have a lot of the information that we spoke about today about preparing for the CMMC assessment. And then, of course, at any time you can email or use the meeting link to actually put 15-30 minutes on the calendar with me, and we can discuss what you're currently doing with CMMC currently, maybe cybersecurity, security operations, if that's something more of interest of what you're looking for, and talk about if and how MAD Security would be able to assist. And that does bring us to the Q&A session. So this is actually going to be time for you to ask all the questions that you have, anything that you may want to know specifics about. We'll get to as many as we can. If we cannot reach your question before we have to end here today, please go ahead and ask all the questions. We'll be able to get around to those, emailing you back or giving you a call after. So we actually do have a little. Here already. Can you still hear me on your side, Jaclyn?
Yes. Now I cannot hear you, Adam.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, my headset's been cutting out during the middle of calls. All right, so we're going to get back here. The first live question that we have, Jaclyn, is does having software to track your compliance, like Venta's example, does that help during the assessment with like common language and familiarity?
Okay. I will tell you how it helps. During an assessment, not necessarily, because what the assessor is going to want to see is that you have to give them an SSP ahead of time. It has to be a point in time. So they're not going to want to see something that can be editable, modified day to day during your assessment. They're going to require you to export that out. And so that during the assessment, not necessarily. Where it's really going to help you though is a lot of that software. I'm not sure. I'm not as familiar with Vanta. I've never used that one, but I've seen other software. What it'll do is it helps you understand what the requirements of control are, tell you what type of evidence you need to upload for each of those control requirements. And a lot of people just don't have that understanding without having some kind of assistance. So that's where that kind of software really does help you, is really more the preparation, getting your documentation in line the way that it needs to be, especially if it's something that will export things out for you. And maybe if you upload evidence and it renames the file names of that evidence to relate to the control, that's where that's really beneficial. I have seen some software that it's very beneficial over some of the other ones I've seen. So during the assessment, not necessarily, because again, you have to give them all your documentation ahead of time. They're going to go through that. They're not really going to look at your compliance software during the assessment. They're going to want you to see live things on your screen, show them technical configurations, and they want the documentation submitted ahead of time. So, but the prep is really where it's going to help you at.
Absolutely. And prep's a big key of it for sure. So I'd
Yeah.
definitely say things like that are going to be awesome. All right. Let's see. Next question that we have here, and keep them coming. We'll get to as many as we can. Like I said, we'll get to you if we cannot get to yours. As there, we've got quite a few in the queue here. All right. How much evidence do assessors actually expect to see?
More than you're going to think. So what they're going to do is they're going to go control by control, objective by objective, not necessarily the domains in order. We've seen them skip around, but they definitely will address each objective of every control. And so whether it's a documentation, maybe it's technical configuration, they will want to see evidence for almost literally everything that's in those 300 treaty objectives. And so again, documentation configuration depends on what the objective is, which type of evidence they want to see, but you're going to be shown a lot of evidence.
Let's see. Next one. What happens like if an assessor doesn't understand how we implemented the control?
Yeah, so essentially you need to be confident in what you're doing and how you are meeting the requirements of the control. If you believe you are meeting the requirements and the assessor asks you a different way or asks whatever, be prepared to justify that, especially if it's something that you know is not normal. Other people do it this way, but we're going to do it this way. Be prepared to justify that. I would practice talking about that ahead of time. I'd look at the objectives of the control, explain how you are meeting each of the objectives that's relevant to that. And it's really just, you have to essentially prove and talk your way through it and get the assessor to agree that you are meeting the requirements. That's kind of the thing that we see a lot, is just that goes into preparation also. Just be prepared to talk about how you're doing it.
Absolutely. Let's see. What is the biggest documentation mistake that companies make?
Yeah, either not documenting to begin with, you're doing something where you don't have the documentation part of it, or your documentation was maybe all great and all the way you intended for you guys to follow, but you're not actually following what your documentation says it's supposed to be. So the mismatch between documentation versus what you're doing is the biggest thing. And then again, it's really just, maybe you just don't even have it documented. You're doing it, everything's fine, but you can't really prove to the assessor you've got a repeatable process that you follow. Maybe only one person at the company knows how to do it, but someone else doesn't know how to do it. So that's kind of the documentation mistakes, is document what you're doing, making sure they match what you're actually doing.
Absolutely. We've got about 8 more here. We're only going to be able to knock one more out just because we told you guys we'd end this around 2:45 or so Central Time. So we're going to do one more, then I've got a couple more slides to finish it out, but keep them coming, I promise. We are going to get back to you if you ask us the questions. We've got people on standby ready to answer those questions for you. So I'm going to try to ask one here that has not been answered in the presentation, or maybe needs a little more clarity here. Okay, so I kind of touched on this, talking about reaching out to primes and asking, but I think this is a good one to elaborate on. This client says, we don't see CMMC mentioned in our contract, do we still need to worry about it?
Yeah, so if you handle CUI at all, you definitely have to. If you even think you're going to for related to a contract that you might be awarded, yes. But what some people have a misconception that they're going to see the word CMC in their contract. That's not the case. You're going to see DFARS 7012. Maybe you see some other terminology. Maybe your prime contractor is going to build it in, and they're not specifically says the word CMC. So if you handle controlled and classified information at all, CMC is going to apply to you. So it's kind of like it's really if you have an understanding that you might have that data or you might get a contract for that data, it does apply. It just may not be specifically have the word CMC in it.
Yeah, it's a good way to explain it for sure. Because I know me. Whenever I start going through it, I start looking for the word CMMC as well at first. So I totally get it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, like I said, we're going to get around to everybody's that we couldn't answer live here. So we're going to get those answered for you. So please look out for that. We're going to be with you very shortly. I did just want to cover a couple more things here before we go. All webinars start at 2 p.m. Central on the third Thursday of each month, which puts the next one set at January 15th, 2026, and will actually launch you into this next upcoming year, get you started off on the right foot. I didn't have the dates. I don't have the titles for everything that's going through because I am going to be making some changes to the content that's going to keep up with what's going on in the CMMC realm at this very moment. But please come back and join us January 15th, 2026, 2 p.m. We've got a lot of people coming regularly now for the CMMC and cybersecurity information. So thank you for coming. And then I would like to transition that into thank you for sticking with us a couple minutes past time. If you would like to discuss where you stand or what you need for 2026, again, you can email me at the astarnes@madsecinc.com, ASTARNES@madsecinc.com. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Merry Christmas and happy holidays, and we will see you next year. Thank you so much. Have a great day.